In April 2026, Viktor Orbán conceded defeat after 16 years in power. The headlines wrote themselves. Hungary turns pro-EU, the disruptor is gone, Brussels can breathe easier. 1 week later, Bulgarians prepare to vote, and the most likely winner of that election is Rumen Radev, a man whose policy positions on Russia, Russian sanctions, and EU unity look uncomfortably familiar to anyone who watched Orbán operate. The relief in European capitals, I think, is warranted. But we should remain ever vigilant. The machinery that made Orbán possible hasn't been dismantled. A single leader inside the EU's unanimity rules can still reshape decisions worth billions, veto aid to Ukraine, and give Moscow a foothold in rooms where it has no right to sit. Russia knows this, and they've been exploiting it for many years, and will not stop now. Viktor Orbán built a political system that functioned perfectly well inside the European Union, while systematically working against it. For 16 years, he held power through a mix of genuine popular support, institutional engineering, media control, and election tampering. His Fidesz party rewrote Hungary's constitution, restructured the judiciary, and created what Orbán himself described as an illiberal state, citing Vladimir Putin and Recep Erdogan as models. The mechanisms were elegant in their ruthlessness. Orbán weaponized EU membership itself, extracting billions in funds while defying Brussels' rule of law conditions, threatening vetoes on budget decisions and using EU enlargement politics as leverage. When Ukraine needed a 90 billion euro loan to stay afloat, Orbán blocked it, despite this money primarily coming not from Hungarian people's pockets, but from frozen Russian assets. When the EU tried to speak with one voice on Russia, Orbán softened every communication. He did all of this without ever leaving the club. Hungary remained in NATO. Orbán attended summits, shook hands, and played the part of a difficult partner, never a departing one. That was the point. The disruption worked precisely because Hungary stayed inside the European tent. The 16 years of Orbán also produced measurable economic deterioration that undermines the sovereignties argument. Hungary has been rapidly falling behind its peers. When it joined the EU, it ranked 19th by GDP per capita, and by the end of Orbán's tenure, it had fallen to 23rd to 27th place, behind Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Lithuania, a country that started the 1990s in far worse shape than Hungary, now achieves 90% of average EU income. The Orbán model has, in practice, produced decline. To understand why Orbán's departure matters, and why it might matter less than it appears, you need to understand what a single EU member state can actually do. EU foreign policy, sanctions, and budgetary decisions require unanimous support. This is by design. It gives small states a voice and prevents majorities from steamrolling minorities. But it also creates a structural vulnerability that Orbán exploited masterfully. Any member state can threaten to veto. Any member state can extract concessions by simply refusing to agree. The tools are legal, permanent, and available to whoever holds power next. Orbán used these tools to soften or block every package of sanctions on Russia since 2022, hold up the EU budget, threaten vetoes over Ukraine's EU accession talks, and prevent military aid for Ukraine from transiting through Hungary. The Sziarto leaks revealed something more alarming. Hungary's foreign minister had been briefing Moscow directly on EU summit negotiations. This was active intelligence sharing with the adversary, allowing them to always be one step ahead of the European Union. The leaks demonstrated that internal EU disruption could escalate from rhetorical obstruction to direct intelligence compromise, and created a template Russia could replicate in other member states. This capacity does not disappear when Orbán leaves office. The structural rules in EU decision-making haven't changed, and changing them requires unanimous agreement, which means that any future disruptor finds the same doors unlocked. The disinformation infrastructure that supported Orbán's narratives also hasn't disappeared. Bulgaria is perhaps the most cultivated ground in the EU for this kind of influence. A combination of historical Russophilia, a media landscape saturated with pro-Kremlin outlets, and a population economically vulnerable enough that economic grievance narratives land easily. And in case you haven't noticed, there is a wave of authoritarianism sweeping over the West right now. A new Orbán can emerge at any moment, and Bulgaria is the perfect ground for this. To understand why Bulgaria matters so much, you need to understand what has happened there since 2021. Since 2021, there have been 8 elections, 8 attempts to form a stable government, and 8 failures. The country has been in near continuous political crisis, with governments collapsing under the weight of corruption allegations, protest waves, and the inability of any party to command a parliamentary majority. The latest collapse came in December 2025, triggered by a budget plan that demonstrators called the worst in 30 years. The protests, initially organized by the reformist PPDB party, quickly became larger, a youth-led, TikTok-organized uprising that drew between 150,000 to 250,000 people onto the streets of Bulgarian cities in a single day. These were the largest protests since the 90s. The protesters had specific targets. Boyko Borisov, the former prime minister who had dominated Bulgarian politics for 12 years, and Delan Peevski, the USA and UK-sanctioned oligarch who controls enough of Bulgaria's media, prosecution service, and electoral machinery to function as a parallel power center. So, the Zhelaskov government resigned within 2 weeks of the protests. The protests worked, but only partially. The government fell, but the deep state didn't. And this has been a repeating pattern for years now. Into this recent power vacuum stepped Rumen Radev. Radev had been Bulgaria's president since 2017, a former Air Force general who won office with support from the Bulgarian Socialist Party and governed as an independent, increasingly at odds with the parties that had elevated him. He had clashed with every government, positioned himself as above the fray, and built a public profile as a straight-talking military strongman. In January 2026, Radev did something no Bulgarian head of state had done in the post-communist era. He resigned mid-term, and he founded a new party called Progressive Bulgaria, declaring his intention to become prime minister. This move was audacious. It is also seductive for many Bulgarians. To many, Radev has been the face of presidential opposition to the Borisov governments. He had even endorsed the December 2025 protests. He spoke of fighting corruption and protecting ordinary Bulgarians from economic pain. What was less clear was what Radev actually intends to do with power, particularly with the deep state structures that had survived every election and every protest. Sociological surveys ahead of the April 2026 parliamentary elections place Progressive Bulgaria clearly ahead. Radev's party has approximately 32%, which translates to roughly 90 seats in a 240-seat parliament. GERB trails at around 20%, that is Boyko Borisov's party. The reformist PPDB coalition sits at 12 to 15%. So no single party is close to a majority, which is a familiar sight in recent Bulgarian history. What boosts progressive Bulgaria's performance at the polls is the fact that they are drawing support from across the political spectrum. БСП defectors on the left, this is the Bulgarian Socialist Party, protest voters from the center, and a substantial block of Russophilic, Eurosceptic Bulgarians. Plus, Bulgarians just love a sweet-talking strongman. Approximately half of Radev's potential voter base is pro-Russian and skeptical of European integration. Yet his public messaging has remained carefully pro-European. The gap between the party's stated platform and its actual base suggests either Radev would govern as a reformer who would restrain his more extreme supporters, or that the extreme supporters are the point, and the pro-European rhetoric is a mask that would come off after the election. This voter coalition has been actively cultivated by a disinformation apparatus that has operated in Bulgaria for years. Pro-Kremlin media slowly created much of the audience he is now harvesting. The disinformation playbook has been systematically shaping which fears to amplify. For example, inflation, pension cuts, energy prices, which leaders to trust, for example, ambivalent ones like Radev, and whether reformist voters should vote at all. A Bulgaria in economic turmoil, fueled by euro adoption fears, inflation concerns, and general distrust of Brussels, is easier to influence than a stable, integrated one. The disinformation campaign targets not to inform Bulgarian voters, but to manipulate their emotions and decisions in ways that serve Moscow's strategic objectives. Radev's policy positions are a study in strategic ambiguity. On Russia, his positions are harder to reconcile with EU consensus. He has refused to send weapons to Ukraine. He blocked military aid transits through Bulgaria. In a February 2026 interview with Berliner Zeitung, he said Bulgaria needed to talk to Russia directly, arguing that without dialogue, European security architecture would be, quote-unquote, based on rivalry and constant war thinking. He described EU sanctions as counterproductive, and he suggested Bulgaria could restore its energy relationship with Moscow. He consistently uses the typical Kremlin talking points, suggesting the war is terrible and thus Ukraine should probably just give up to save lives. What makes Radev's positions particularly significant is that they consistently align almost perfectly with a documented 5-narrative framework that pro-Kremlin media has been deploying in Bulgaria for years. These interlocking narratives are: Russia is our liberator, Brussels is our new occupier. Exploiting pan-Slavic identity and the 1878 liberation myth. Every euro sent to Kiev is stolen from Bulgarian pensioners. An economic grievance narrative that has proven particularly effective with older voters. The patriot versus the collaborator, framing pro-Western politicians as foreign agents and the West will abandon us anyway, which destroys faith in collective security guarantees to make bilateral deals with Russia appear rational. Radev's rhetoric actively legitimizes these narratives. This creates a feedback loop. His positions validate the disinformation ecosystem, and the disinformation ecosystem amplifies his campaign messaging to voters already primed to distrust Brussels. This represents the most sophisticated form of influence, creating a political actor whose views already match the desired outcome. There is something more specific worth noting. In his Panorama interview, which is a Bulgarian TV talk show, Radev explicitly cited Viktor Orbán as a good example of governance. He also praised purchasing Russian energy resources, directly mirroring Orbán's energy policy. When pressed on these statements after Orbán's crushing electoral defeat in April 2026, Radev's associate attempted a remarkable rebranding. He would now be cast as Bulgaria's Magyar. Critics dismissed this as a transparent opportunism. There was an awkward pivot after the Radev-Orbán relationship became politically inconvenient. On the Eurozone, Radev has found a particularly convenient position. He officially supports Euro adoption to some extent. The same goal as the current caretaker government he openly criticizes. But he also called for a referendum on the question in late 2025, trying to escalate concerns with the adoption of the euro. The problem is that under Bulgarian law, euro adoption is a parliamentary matter, not a subject to referendum. His proposed referendum was unconstitutional, and he knew that. It was just a delaying mechanism that cultivates confusion. By wrapping himself in the flag of euro adoption, while demanding an impossible precondition, Radev can appeal to pro-EU moderates who hear his words while serving mostly the Eurosceptic base that understands the referendum basically means not yet and maybe never. Pro-Russian media have weaponized euro adoption fears aggressively, warning that joining the euro would trigger price surges and economic pain. This disinformation campaign contributed directly to the political instability that preceded the December 2025 government collapse. Radev's ambiguity on the Eurozone serves the same function his ambiguity on everything else serves. It keeps all of his options open. On corruption, he pledges an uncompromising fight without ever naming the people who run the country from the shadows. He has never publicly identified Delian Peevski or Boyko Borisov as targets, despite both men being the explicit objects of the December 2025 protests. His refusal to name names has been read as a signal. He might be planning to work with the deep state. There is a phrase circulating Bulgarian political circles that captures something important here. 3 Orbáns. Bulgaria doesn't have an Orbán problem. It has 3 of them. Orbán in Hungary created a top-down system where a single leader captured the state. Bulgaria's equivalent operates differently. 3 figures playing complementary roles. Boyko Borisov is the electoral vehicle. For 12 years as prime minister, he maintained power through patronage, media control, and strategically timed elections. His GERB party provides the votes, not necessarily because Bulgarians love him, but because he controls enough of the state apparatus to manufacture consent. Delian Peevski is the institutional grip. He controls the prosecution service, enough to open investigations against opponents and close them against allies. He owns media outlets that shape narratives. His power is deeply structural. It survives government changes because it doesn't depend on necessarily winning elections. And Radev, he is the ambivalent outsider. His value lies in his ability to position himself as an opponent while trying to maintain relationships with all factions. He has never named either of the previously mentioned men as a corruption target. His independence is a pose that preserves options. What is perhaps most revealing is the competition for the Orbán model mantle. Multiple figures sought this role. Radev, Borisov, and members of the DPS Novo Nachalo all publicly praised Orbán during his political dominance. They cited his governance style, his energy policies, his ability to control state institutions while remaining inside EU structures. And then came April 2026. Orbán lost with 80% voter turnout and roughly 70% support for the opposition. All Bulgarian pro-Orbán actors immediately ceased referencing him entirely. Not a single one distanced themselves from him explicitly. They just went silent. This pattern, praise while winning, silence when losing, reveals that their admiration was conditional on success, not on ideological conviction per se. These actors work together through shared interests, preserving a system where none of them needs to defeat the others, because the system already protects all of them. Radev represents the same disruption vector, but perhaps with a different business model. Where Orbán openly defied Brussels, Radev might simply ensure nothing much changes. Or, after coming into power, his method might shift and become more Orbán-esque. Beneath the electoral spectacle lies a detail that reveals how Bulgarian politics actually functions, and why Radev's promises of reform should be viewed with skepticism. In 2022, the year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Bulgaria signed a long-term natural gas supply contract with Botash, a Turkish state-owned company. Radev, being the president, was a key figure in the negotiations. This Botash deal is extraordinary for one reason. It is the only agreement in Bulgaria's post-Soviet history that was signed by every parliamentary group. GERB, БСП, ДПС all supported it. This cross-party consensus is unprecedented and deeply troubling. The deal commits Bulgaria to indirectly purchasing Russian gas at a very disadvantageous price, embedding the country deeper into an Orbán-esque energy dependency on Russia. The exact terms of the deal remain classified. By 2024, investigative authorities had conducted interrogations and established evidence of criminal composition in the deal. But the case has sat in the prosecutor's office for 2 years without resolution. The cross-party signature creates a mutual compromat structure. Each party that signed has exposure, meaning no party has an incentive to investigate aggressively. When Radev speaks of fighting corruption, this is the context. He was president during the deal's negotiation and implementation. He did not criticize it. He went forward with the deal. His silence suggests complicity, fear, or a calculation that some forms of corruption are too useful to uproot. The way the deal had been investigated, or rather not investigated, also exemplifies how the Bulgarian deep state operates. Radev was a useful scapegoat to blame for the deal, while many of the actors involved are hiding in the shadows. Perhaps one of the reasons the court case is still ongoing is because it allows for Radev, who is under constant pressure because of it, to be used as a puppet. If there were doubts about Radev's intentions, his campaign spending could shed some light on them. The scale of expenditure on his campaign defied normal Bulgarian electoral economics. Campaign offices opened in cities across the country very quickly. These were glossy operations that would be impressive in Western Europe. Billboards in every major city. Massive social media activation, particularly on TikTok, where Progressive Bulgaria achieved 90 million views at its peak. Some political analysts suggest that these spending patterns are more associated with electoral autocracies than actual functioning democracies. Mid-campaign, the European Commission opened an investigation into Radev's campaign finances. Suddenly, activity on social media stopped, notably coordinated, as if a switch had been flipped as soon as the investigation started. The campaign pulled back from platforms where questions were being asked. This pattern, massive spending, opaque funding, suspicious withdrawal when scrutiny intensifies, resembles the Orbán playbook. If Radev becomes prime minister with a campaign funded by unknown sources, he begins his term with obligations he hasn't disclosed. I think it might be becoming clearer to you where his obligations actually lie. In conclusion, Viktor Orbán is gone. That is a real reason for Europe to rejoice. Peter Magyar won a genuine election on a genuine reform platform, and the Hungarian vote inside EU will soon likely align better with the European mainstream. What hasn't changed is the European system itself. The unanimity rules that gave Orbán his leverage in EU decision-making remain in place, because reforming them requires unanimous agreement. Furthermore, the deep state structures that sustain corruption inside EU member states, like Bulgaria, haven't been touched by any institutional mechanism that Brussels controls. Bulgaria is perhaps the most suitable environment for the emergence of a new Orbán. Rumen Radev, in my opinion, is right now the most viable candidate. His positions on Russia, his explicit admiration for Orbán's governance model, his ambiguity towards the deep state, his campaign spending from opaque sources, and his ability to hold together a coalition spanning reformers to Russophiles to former members of the corrupted parties he swears to fight, make him exactly the kind of partner Moscow is looking for. Perhaps not an ally who will openly serve Kremlin interests, but one whose policy preferences already align with what Russia wants. In other words, Radev might not be a Russian agent per se, but it could be even worse. He is an ideological ally of Putin. Hungary, under Orbán, rapidly fell in terms of living standards, with higher inflation and half the economic growth of Bulgaria. The sovereigntist promise of standing alone against Brussels produced measurable decline, not prosperity. But that evidence exists, and Bulgaria's Orbán-aspiring politicians chose to ignore it, until Orbán's defeat made the topic uncomfortable. The European Union celebrated the end of one disruptor's era, but it may be walking towards the beginning of another's. Whether it recognizes the pattern in time depends on whether it pays attention to what's happening in Bulgaria. Thank you for watching this video till the end. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to let me know, for example by hitting the like button. You can also support my efforts by sharing this video with even just one other person who you think needs to see this. What do you think about Orbán's defeat and the future of European politics? Thank you.